Picture this: a lone bell tower piercing the quiet of a medieval morning, its deep, resonant toll cutting through the mist. But this isn't just any bell ringing for prayer or celebration. This sound carries a desperate warning, a signal racing from village to village, across rivers and over mountains, faster than any horse or messenger could hope to travel. In an age without phones, without radios, even without the printed word, how did a single tower's chime become the lifeline of an entire continent? This is the story of one of history's most ingenious early warning systems, a network of bell towers so finely tuned that they could alert nations of invasion before the enemy even crossed the border. It's easy to forget just how vulnerable medieval Europe was. With no instant communication, a surprise attack could mean devastation before neighboring towns even knew danger was near. But people back then weren't helpless. They turned the very landscape into a weapon, using the height of church towers, the reach of sound, and the precision of timing to create a system that was as beautiful as it was brilliant. Each tower stood like a sentinel, spaced just far enough apart that the next could hear its warning and pass it along. And when the first bell rang out, the message didn't just travel, it multiplied, leaping from hilltop to hilltop in a wave of urgency that could cross hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. What's even more astonishing, this wasn't just noise, it was a language. Different patterns of rings could signal the direction of the threat, the size of the invading force, even the best routes to safety. Villagers knew whether to grab their weapons or their children, to flee to the forests or barricade in the church, and it worked, not once, but for centuries, turning what should have been easy conquests into defended stands that shaped the fate of kingdoms. By the time we're done, you'll see how these towers did more than save lives. They wove communities together in a way that still echoes in how we communicate today. So let's step back into a world where a single strike of a bell could change history. To understand how these towers became Europe's early warning system, we have to look back at their beginnings. Bell towers first rose across the medieval landscape as symbols of faith, their chimes marking the rhythms of daily life, calling communities to prayer, signaling the start of markets, or tolling for funerals. But their towering height and commanding presence soon revealed another purpose. When raiders appeared on the horizon or fires broke out in crowded towns, those same bells could cut through the chaos with a clarity that shouts or horns couldn't match. Monasteries were among the first to grasp their strategic value. Isolated and vulnerable, monks built bell towers not just for worship but as watchturns, their elevated vantage points offering the first glimpse of approaching danger. By the 9th century, records show towns along the Rhine and Danube using bells to alert locals of Viking longships slipping upriver. The sound carried farther than any runner, buying precious time to hide food, gather weapons, or flee. And as invasions grew more frequent, the system evolved. Towns began spacing towers within earshot of one another, creating chains of sound that could relay warnings like a medieval game of telephone, except with life or death stakes. What made this network so effective wasn't just the bells themselves, but the way communities standardized their use. A slow, steady toll might signal a distant threat, while frantic, uneven ringing meant danger was imminent. Coastal towers developed distinct patterns to differentiate between pirate raids and storms. In mountainous regions, echoes could carry messages across valleys without a single extra tower. And crucially, everyone, from nobles to farmers, knew the codes. This wasn't a top-down military system. It was a shared language refined through generations of trial and error. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century put these networks to the ultimate test. As swift-moving horsemen swept across Eastern Europe, towns with bell towers had hours, sometimes days of warning compared to those relying on scouts. In Hungary, records describe how the deep toll of a single monastery bell near the Carpathians triggered a cascade of signals, arming villages hundreds of miles away before the first Mongol rider even crossed the border. That delay didn't just save lives, it allowed armies to rally, turning what could have been a rout into a coordinated defense. Yet the true genius of this system lay in its simplicity. Unlike smoke signals or beacon fires, which required clear weather and constant vigilance, bells worked in fog, darkness, even rain. Their sound penetrated thick forest cover and stone walls, reaching farmers in distant fields and merchants in bustling markets alike. And because every village already had a church or town hall, the infrastructure was already in place, no need for kings or generals to fund it. This was defense by community, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful tools aren't weapons, but shared knowledge and trust. The secret behind these life-saving alarms wasn't just in how they were used, it was in how they were made. Not every bell could serve as a warning signal. Ordinary church bells designed for melody and harmony often blended into the background noise of daily life. But the tocsin, a specialized alarm bell, was engineered for one purpose: to pierce through chaos and demand attention. Craftsmen across medieval Europe perfected the art of casting these bells, tweaking everything from the thickness of the bronze to the curve of the lip to create a sound that could travel farther and cut deeper than any other. Take the great tocsin of Rouen, forged in the 13th century. Weighing nearly 4 tons, its deep, shuddering toll could be heard over 15 miles away on a clear day. But it wasn't just size that mattered. The alloy itself was a carefully guarded recipe, a mix of copper and tin with traces of silver, said to give the tone an eerie, lingering quality that clung to the air. And the shape, unlike the rounded curves of musical bells, tocsin profiles were often sharper, almost angular, designed to amplify certain frequencies that carried best over hills and through forests. The mechanics of ringing these giants were just as ingenious. Swinging a multi-ton bell required more than brute strength. Towers were outfitted with massive wooden beams, counterweighted to allow a single ringer to set the bell in motion with rhythmic pulls. Some systems even used a rotating wheel mechanism, letting the bell's own momentum build into a deafening, rhythmic alarm, and speed mattered. The faster the swing, the more urgent the sound. That's why many tocsin bells had a distinctive uneven rhythm when rung at full tilt, a staccato pattern that instinctively set hearts racing. But not every warning required earth-shaking force. Smaller tocsin bells, often mounted in village squares or atop gatehouses, served a different role. Their higher-pitched, sharper tones were perfect for hyper-local alerts, signaling a fire in the marketplace or a breach in the town walls. In regions like the Alps, where echoes could distort deep tones, these lighter bells became the backbone of the warning system, and some towns even developed layered codes, using large and small bells in tandem, like the difference between a booming drum and a snapping snare in a military cadence. What's fascinating is how these designs spread. There was no central authority dictating bell-making standards, just countless anonymous craftsmen sharing techniques through guild networks and trade routes. An innovation in Flanders might appear in Bohemia a decade later, adapted for local conditions, and when invaders like the Ottomans began using their own alarm systems, European towns even reverse-engineered captured bells to steal acoustic secrets. This was a rare medieval example of open-source technology, where every improvement could mean the difference between safety and slaughter. By the late Middle Ages, the tocsin had become so refined that experts could identify a bell's origin by its tone alone, like recognizing a voice in a crowd. Pilgrims' journals mention hearing distant warning bells from 3 valleys away and knowing exactly which duchy was under threat. That's the true marvel here. These weren't just noisemakers. They were precision instruments honed by generations of artisans who understood that in a world without amplifiers or satellites, sound itself could be a shield. Imagine living in a world where your safety depended not on walls or weapons, but on a web of trust stretching across kingdoms. The real power of medieval bell towers wasn't in their individual strength, but in their connections. A single tower might protect one village, but when linked to others, it became part of something far greater, a living network that turned scattered communities into a unified early warning system. And here's the remarkable part: this wasn't orchestrated by kings or armies. It was built by ordinary people who understood that survival meant working together. The system's brilliance lay in its simplicity. Towers were spaced roughly 5 to 10 miles apart. The maximum distance sound could reliably travel across open countryside. Each one served as both listener and broadcaster, poised to catch a distant warning and immediately amplify it. Picture a chain reaction. A bell tolls in a border town. The next tower picks it up within minutes, and within hours, the message has leaped across valleys and rivers, reaching places the original watchers had never even seen. In some regions, like the rolling hills of Tuscany or the flat plains of Flanders, this network became so refined that signals could cross an entire territory faster than a galloping horse. What kept this system from descending into chaos was a shared language of sound. Unlike modern emergency alerts with their standardized sirens, medieval communities developed local codes tailored to their threats. Along the Baltic coast, 2 rapid tolls followed by a pause might warn of Viking ships, while inland towns used alternating high and low pitches to signal approaching cavalry. The key was consistency. Every villager, from shepherds in the fields to blacksmiths at their forges, knew these patterns by heart. It was a rare example of universal literacy in an age where few could read or write. Political borders meant nothing to these networks. A bell tower in French Burgundy might relay warnings from German-speaking Lorraine without hesitation, because danger respected no treaties. Monasteries played a crucial role in maintaining these cross-border connections. As neutral, scholarly hubs with vast communication networks, monks often served as the system's technicians, calibrating tower placements and training new ringers. During the 100 Years' War, records show French and English-held towns still sharing bell signals when bandit hordes threatened both. A temporary truce in sound. But trust was fragile. False alarms could unravel years of coordination in an instant. That's why many towns imposed harsh penalties for unauthorized ringing, sometimes even death. In Prague, a 14th century law required 3 separate watchmen to confirm a threat before the tocsin sounded. Other cities kept their bells locked with multiple keys, distributed among trusted officials. The system only worked because everyone knew the stakes. When the bells rang true, they didn't just carry noise. They carried the collective hope of entire regions, a testament to what communities could achieve when they chose cooperation over chaos. The legacy of these networks still echoes today. Modern emergency broadcast systems, with their tiered alerts and redundancy protocols, owe an unconscious debt to those medieval ringers. There's something profoundly human in the way ordinary people turn church towers into instruments of collective survival, proof that even in fractured times, connection could be the strongest defense of all. The story of how bells first became Europe's guardians begins on a foggy morning along the French coast in the 10th century. Viking longships had terrorized these shores for generations, their shallow drafts allowing them to slip silently up rivers and strike before anyone could react. But one coastal monastery changed everything. Perched on a cliff near what's now Normandy, monks had kept watch for decades, their bell tower standing as both spiritual beacon and silent sentry. Then came the day when a sharp-eyed brother spotted distant sails cutting through the dawn mist. What happened next would rewrite the rules of medieval defense. Instead of fleeing or barricading themselves in, the monks did something unprecedented. They rang their great bronze bell not in prayer but in warning. The deep, urgent peals shattered the morning calm, carrying across fields and marshes to surrounding villages. Farmers dropped their tools, shepherds abandoned flocks, and within minutes, every soul was racing toward the stone sanctuary of the monastery. By the time the Viking raiders beached their ships, they found empty homes, barricaded doors, and most shockingly armed townsmen pouring in from neighboring settlements. The would-be plunderers faced not scattered victims but organized resistance. For perhaps the first time in living memory, the raiders left empty-handed. Word of this miracle spread faster than the bell's own echoes. Within years, similar towers sprouted along vulnerable coastlines from Brittany to Flanders, each one spaced within earshot of the next. What began as monastic improvisation became systematic defense. Regional councils started passing laws requiring every parish to maintain its bell tower in working order, with stiff fines for villages that let their mechanisms rust. In England's Domesday Book, compiled a century later, scribes carefully noted which towns possessed a bell fit for warnings, as seriously as they recorded land or livestock. The Vikings themselves unwittingly proved the system's worth again and again. Sagas from the late 10th century complain of Norse raids failing because the Christmen's iron voices gave away their approach. One account from Norway even describes warriors timing their attacks for Sundays, when church bells would be ringing for Mass anyway, only to find watchmen had developed distinct alarm patterns. By the year 1000, the once unstoppable raiders were avoiding bell-protected coasts altogether, turning their attention to less organized targets further east. What made this innovation so revolutionary wasn't just its effectiveness, but its accessibility. Unlike castle walls that took years to build or armies that required noble patronage, any village with a church tower could participate. The system scaled effortlessly. A single bell protected one settlement, but linked towers created an impenetrable auditory shield. And because the sound carried equally to rich and poor, it became one of medieval Europe's first truly democratic defenses. When that deep bronze voice spoke, everyone heard the same warning, everyone moved as one, and everyone, from lord to peasant, owed their safety to the same simple technology. The legacy of that 10th century French monastery echoes through military history. Their desperate solution created a template for collective security that would shield towns from Mongols, Ottomans, and countless other threats for over 500 years. More remarkably, it proved that in a fractured world of feuding lords and isolated villages, ordinary people could build networks of trust strong enough to repel empires. All it took was the courage to ring the bell and the wisdom to listen when others did the same. The physics behind these medieval warning systems was as elegant as it was effective. Sound travels through air like ripples across a pond, and the builders of bell towers mastered this natural phenomenon centuries before scientists could explain it. A massive bronze bell struck with precision doesn't just make noise. It creates pressure waves that can roll across landscapes with astonishing efficiency. On quiet mornings when the air was still, the deep tones could carry much farther than any human voice or animal call, sometimes reaching 20 miles or more from their source. What made this possible was the way low-frequency sounds behave in our atmosphere. Unlike high-pitched noises that quickly dissipate, the deep vibrations from large bells had longer wavelengths that resisted interference. They could bend over hills, penetrate through light foliage, and even follow the contours of valleys like water flowing downstream. And when winter came, the cold, dense air actually improved transmission, allowing warnings to travel even farther, a life-saving quirk of physics that villagers came to rely on during the long, vulnerable nights of raiding season. The timing of these acoustic relays defied medieval expectations. While a messenger on horseback might take 3 days to cover 100 miles assuming good roads and fresh mounts, a bell signal could traverse the same distance in mere hours. Tower keepers developed an almost musical sense of timing, waiting just long enough to confirm the pattern before adding their own bell to the chorus. In regions with particularly efficient networks, like the open plains of Hungary or the river valleys of Germany, alerts could propagate at speeds rivaling modern communication, not because the sound itself moved faster, but because each link in the chain reacted with flawless coordination. Weather played a fascinating role in these ancient broadcasts. Fog, which might seem like an obstacle, actually helped contain and direct sound waves along predictable paths. Coastal towns learned to distinguish between the damp, muffled tones coming through sea mists versus the crisp clarity of warnings traveling over dry land. Wind patterns became part of the system's design. Towers were often placed upwind of neighboring settlements so that prevailing breezes would carry their alarms further. Some alpine communities even developed seasonal variations in their codes, accounting for how snow cover changed the way sound reflected across their valleys. The limitations of human hearing shaped the network just as much as the landscape. Watchmen stationed in towers weren't just listening for any sound, they were trained to pick out specific patterns from the constant background noise of rural life. The repetitive nature of alarm sequences helped distinguish them from random echoes or industrial sounds, and because low frequencies travel farthest, many warning bells were tuned to notes near the lower limit of human hearing, creating vibrations people could feel in their chests before they fully heard them, an early version of modern bass-heavy emergency alerts. This system's reliability became legendary. Chronicles from the 14th century described towns receiving word of distant battles or approaching armies hours before the first dust appeared on the horizon. During one famous incident in Burgundy, a chain of 37 towers relayed news of an English incursion across 200 miles in less than 4 hours, a speed that stunned contemporary observers. Messengers arriving later with written confirmations found entire regions already mobilized, their defenses prepared thanks to nothing more than bronze and air and human ingenuity. Perhaps most remarkably, these networks achieved something medieval societies struggled with in nearly every other context: standardization across borders. While dialects, laws, and currencies changed every few miles, the basic principles of bell warnings remained consistent enough that travelers could understand alarms in foreign territories. A merchant from Flanders would recognize the same urgency in a Bohemian tower's pattern that he knew from home, proof that when survival was at stake, medieval Europeans could coordinate better than kings and parliaments ever managed. The true measure of their success lies in the reactions of would-be conquerors. Ottoman records complain about Christian bell networks spoiling surprise attacks, while Mongol scouts reported having to detour hundreds of miles to approach from unexpected directions. Some invaders even tried sabotaging towers only to discover that destroying one bell simply made villagers listen more intently for its neighbors. In the end, these communities had weaponized something far more powerful than steel: the very air they breathed. Monasteries didn't just participate in this early warning system, they perfected it. While castles and towns focused on their own defenses, monastic communities saw the bigger picture. Their secluded hilltop locations, chosen for spiritual contemplation, became accidental fortresses with panoramic views of the countryside. A Benedictine abbey in the Swiss Alps, for example, could spot smoke from a burning village 3 valleys away long before the local lord's scouts. But what made monks truly indispensable wasn't just their vantage points, it was their minds. As some of the few literate people in medieval Europe, they kept meticulous records of invasions, noting which toll patterns worked best and how long it took signals to travel between specific towers. These weren't just logs, they were early data sets analyzed and improved upon over generations. The Benedictines in particular turned bell signaling into an art form. At Cluny Abbey in 12th century France, monks developed a system of staggered tolls that could indicate not just danger but the type of threat. 3 measured strikes might mean approaching night, while rapid alternating rings signaled peasant uprisings. Some orders took this further, creating what amounted to acoustic encryption. Cistercian monasteries along the German border used sequences based on liturgical hours patterns that would sound like ordinary prayers to outsiders but carried precise meanings to trained ears. A visitor might hear what sounded like Vespers bells at noon and think nothing of it, while nearby villages knew to bar their gates against Hungarian raiders. What's often overlooked is how monasteries solved the system's biggest weakness: trust. In a fractured landscape of feuding lords and competing towns, no noble wanted to rely on his enemies' warning bells. But monasteries stood above these squabbles. Their allegiance was to the church, not local rulers, making them neutral ground. When a Cistercian bell rang in disputed territory between France and the Holy Roman Empire, both sides heeded it equally. This spiritual authority allowed warnings to cross political borders effortlessly. During the Great Famine of the 14th century, abbots even repurposed the network to coordinate grain shipments, proving its versatility beyond warfare. The daily rhythm of monastic life made them ideal keepers of this system. While villagers and soldiers came and went, monks maintained unwavering schedules. Their constant presence meant towers were always manned, their strict timekeeping ensured signals were relayed with precision, and their vow of poverty eliminated the corruption that plagued secular watchmen. In many regions, the position of bell ringer became a sacred duty, with novices training for years to master the exact pressure needed to swing massive tocsin bells without cracking them. Some abbey records show monks practicing emergency drills in peacetime, their robes swirling as they raced up tower steps to simulate invasion alerts. Perhaps the most striking testament to their dedication comes from the ruins of Monte Cassino. Before its destruction in World War II, this Italian monastery preserved a 9th century ledger detailing how monks had maintained bell signals through a Lombard siege. Even as attackers surrounded the walls, brothers continued ringing patterns to nearby towns, knowing full well it might draw enemy attention. Their last entry simply states, "Let the bells speak when voices fail." That unwavering commitment, repeated across hundreds of monasteries, transformed what could have been a patchwork of local alerts into a continent-spanning shield. While kings built castles and armies, it was these robed sentinels in their remote towers who truly gave Europe its ears, and with them, precious time to prepare against the storms of history. The year 1241 dawned with terror for Eastern Europe. The Mongols, masters of lightning-fast warfare, had already crushed armies from Kiev to Poland when their gaze turned south toward Hungary. Their tactics relied on shock and disarray, striking before defenses could mobilize, vanishing into the steppes before counterattacks formed. But this time, something disrupted their rhythm. As the first Mongol scouts appeared near the Carpathian passes, watchmen in a lonely border tower did what their ancestors had done for generations. They rang the bell. Not the gentle call to vespers, but the jagged, urgent peals of the tocsin, swinging so violently the whole tower seemed to shake. What happened next defied Mongol expectations. Instead of panicked chaos, villages emptied in perfect order. Farmers drove livestock to prearranged forest hideouts, while women and children streamed toward stone fortresses with bundles of grain slung over their backs. By the time Mongol riders reached the first settlements, they found smoldering signal fires on hilltops and silent, abandoned homes. The invaders pressed onward, only to encounter the same eerie preparedness at every turn. A Hungarian chronicler later wrote that the Mongols seemed vexed as by witchcraft, unable to comprehend how news of their advance raced ahead without visible messengers. The secret lay in Hungary's meticulously maintained bell network. Unlike Western Europe's patchwork of independent towers, Hungarian King Bela IV had standardized his realm's warning system decades earlier, inspired by reports of Mongol tactics from embattled ruse princes. Towers here stood precisely 6 Roman miles apart, each manned by royal watchmen trained to distinguish between routine tolls and invasion alerts. Most crucially, they developed layered signals, a steady toll for distant threats, accelerating beats for approaching danger, and a final frantic cacophony when enemies breached the horizon. This gradation bought time for phased evacuations, preventing the bottlenecks that doomed other regions. Contemporary accounts reveal the system's stunning efficiency. When the Mongol vanguard crossed the Tisa River, the nearest tower's warning reached Buda Castle nearly 100 miles away before sunset. By morning, every fortress along the Danube had raised its drawbridge, while peasant militias felled trees across mountain passes. Though the Mongols eventually overran Hungary's plains, their advance slowed to a crawl, giving nobles precious weeks to regroup. In one extraordinary case, a chain of 18 towers relayed news of a Mongol feint near Zagreb all the way to the Adriatic coast in under 9 hours, allowing Venetian traders to reroute entire convoys. The psychological impact was equally profound. For the first time in their conquests, the Mongols faced populations that didn't freeze in terror but reacted with disciplined precision. Hungarian monks recorded Mongol scouts capturing bell ringers only to find replacements, often children, scrambling up towers moments later. At the Siege of Esztergom, defenders used coded bell sequences to coordinate sorties, their strikes perfectly timed to the invaders' camp rotations. Even in defeat, the system proved its worth. As Mongol forces withdrew abruptly in 1242, summoned home by the Great Khan's death, the same towers that had signaled retreat now rang out in jubilant, unbroken peals for 3 days, a sound that survivors described as the very voice of hope. This episode reshaped European warfare forever. Military treatises from Prague to Paris began classifying bell networks as strategic assets equal to walls or moats. The Teutonic Knights replicated Hungary's model along their Baltic frontier, while French engineers adapted it into the first standardized national warning system. Most tellingly, when the Mongols returned in 1285, their tactics had changed. They struck in winter when frozen ground muffled bells, proof that even history's most fearsome conquerors had been forced to adapt to the humble power of sound. What began as a desperate improvisation along the Carpathians became Europe's first lesson in collective defense, demonstrating that against overwhelming force, timely information could be as vital as any sword. What medieval bell ringers achieved through observation and instinct, modern acoustic science now confirms with precise measurements. Those deep, resonant tones that carried warnings across continents weren't just loud, they were perfectly tuned to exploit the physics of sound propagation. Large bronze bells predominantly produce low-frequency vibrations between 50 and 200 Hz, a sweet spot where sound waves behave almost like water flowing across terrain. Unlike high-pitched noises that get absorbed quickly by obstacles or scattered by wind, these bass-heavy frequencies can diffract bending around hills, slipping through forest cover, and even skimming along water surfaces with minimal energy loss. Temperature played a surprising role in extending these ancient alarms. On cool mornings when the ground stayed cold while higher air warmed, a phenomenon called temperature inversion occurred, creating an invisible sound channel near the Earth's surface. In valleys like the Rhine or Danube, this natural amplifier could carry a bell's voice 2 or even 3 times its normal range. Watchmen didn't understand the science, but they recognized these singing mornings when the air seemed to hold every note forever, scheduling drills and tests during these optimal conditions. Some towers even developed protocols for foggy days when moisture-laden air conducted sound with eerie clarity, an advantage that saved countless villages during the Mongols' winter campaigns. Water became an accidental ally in this acoustic network. Towers positioned near lakes, rivers, or coastlines benefited from how sound reflects off flat water surfaces. A bell rung near the Loire River in France could effectively broadcast in 2 directions at once, directly through air and via a reflected path off the water. Engineers unknowingly exploited this by clustering towers along trade waterways, creating redundant paths for warnings. In the Baltic region, entire alarm systems were designed around fjords and inlets, where complex echo patterns could bounce signals around corners like medieval sonar. The height of bell towers wasn't just about visibility, it was acoustic engineering. Elevating the sound source above ground clutter reduced interference from buildings, trees, and uneven terrain. Church steeples acted like natural loudspeakers, their tapered shapes helping project sound horizontally rather than wasting energy upward. Some Italian hill towns took this further, carving helical staircases inside towers to create primitive waveguide effects, channeling the bell's vibrations outward in specific directions. When Renaissance architects later designed domed bell chambers, they were unknowingly recreating the vocal tract of a giant, shaping raw noise into focused, far-traveling tones. Most remarkably, these systems self-optimized through generations of trial and error. Towers that proved unreliable were rebuilt or abandoned, while successful placements became models for new construction. The spacing between towers, typically 5 to 10 miles, wasn't arbitrary, but reflected the maximum distance where human ears could reliably distinguish pattern sequences from background noise. In mountainous regions like the Alps, irregular spacing compensated for terrain, with some towers placed much closer where echoes could confuse signals. This organic refinement created networks so precise that during acoustic tests in modern Bavaria, researchers found medieval signal paths aligned almost perfectly with computer-modeled sound propagation maps. The true testament to their effectiveness lies in how these principles still shape emergency systems today. Modern civil defense sirens use similar low-frequency ranges for maximum penetration, while foghorns and avalanche warnings employ the same diffraction effects medieval towers exploited. Even our understanding of urban noise pollution stems from studying how historical bell networks minimized sound waste. Those ancient craftsmen may not have known about wave physics or atmospheric acoustics, but their bronze masterpieces spoke the language of survival, a language written in vibrations that still resonate through the science of sound. Learning the language of bells wasn't something villagers picked up by chance. It was a carefully honed skill, passed down with the same seriousness as sword fighting or farming. Every Sunday after Mass, priests would gather their congregations for what amounted to medieval emergency drills. Picture families standing in the shadow of the church tower, heads tilted as the bell ringer demonstrated the difference between the slow, mournful tolls signaling a distant army and the staccato bursts that meant fire was licking at the mill. These weren't casual lessons. Mistakes could cost lives, so repetition was relentless. Adults practiced until they could identify sequences in their sleep, while children turned them into playground chants, skipping rope to rhymes like long and low means gather slow, quick and sharp means flee the dark. Discipline was ironclad. In 13th century Frankfurt, a baker who rang the town bell as a prank had his right hand publicly amputated, a brutal but effective reminder that these sounds were sacred. Other towns imposed hefty fines or even banishment for false alarms. This harshness wasn't about cruelty, it was about survival. When seconds mattered, hesitation or confusion could doom entire communities. That's why some villages staged surprise drills, with watchmen sounding alarms at random intervals to keep responses razor-sharp. Records from Burgundy describe elderly farmers dropping plows mid-furrow and sprinting to defensive positions within minutes, their movements precise as soldiers. What made this system extraordinary was its universality. In an age where reading was a privilege of nobles and monks, bell language became Europe's first truly inclusive literacy. A merchant from Cologne and a shepherd in Provence might speak different dialects, but they understood the same urgent rhythms ringing through the air. This shared knowledge flattened social hierarchies when danger struck. The richest lord and poorest serf reacted identically to those tones, gathering at prearranged strongholds with equal urgency. Some communities took this education even further. Coastal towns in Normandy trained fishermen to relay bell patterns through horn blasts when fog swallowed the sound, creating a maritime backup system. Alpine villages used yodel-like calls to bounce warnings between valleys where echoes distorted the original tones. And in a stroke of medieval genius, many towers kept simple signal drums alongside their bells, allowing the deaf or hard of hearing to feel vibrations through the ground, an early example of accessible emergency communication. The true test came when real danger appeared. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War describe French villages evacuating with eerie calm as English troops approached, children reciting their rhymes while mothers bundled supplies with practiced efficiency. There were no screams, no chaos, just entire communities moving like a single organism responding to a nerve impulse. This wasn't panic, it was muscle memory forged through generations of disciplined training. When the last villager crossed the drawbridge, the gates would shut with a finality that invaders found unnerving. Time and again, armies expecting easy plunder instead found empty settlements and well-prepared defenders, all because a handful of bronze notes had spoken louder than any war cry. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of this training lies in how it bound communities together. Those same bell patterns that signaled danger also marked weddings, births, and holidays, a reminder that the system existed not just to preserve lives, but a way of life. Modern emergency alerts may be faster and more precise, but they lack the deeply human element of those medieval towers. There's something profoundly moving about picturing grandparents teaching toddlers to recognize warning tones between laughter, turning survival into a shared language that echoed across the centuries. The deep tolling of warning bells that had safeguarded Europe for centuries met its match not with a whisper, but with a thunderous roar, the explosive arrival of gunpowder warfare. By the 1500s, the rules of defense had changed irrevocably. Those towering stone churches and hilltop monasteries that once stood as invincible sentinels now crumbled under cannon fire before their bells could complete a single warning sequence. A Spanish account from the Siege of Antwerp in 1585 describes how Habsburg artillery crews deliberately targeted bell towers first, knowing their destruction would leave cities deaf and dumb to approaching relief forces. The very height that made towers ideal for sound projection now made them irresistible targets for gunners testing their range. But gunpowder wasn't the only revolution silencing the bells. Just as significant was the quiet spread of paper and ink across Europe. where a bell could only signal danger. Printed broadsheets carried specifics the size of approaching forces, their armaments, even the routes they might take. Merchant networks in cities like Augsburg and Venice turned news into a commodity, with handwritten newsletters evolving into regular printed gazettes by the early 1600s. Suddenly, a farmer in rural Saxony could learn about Ottoman movements in Hungary not from distant peals, but from a peddler's freshly inked bulletin days before any threat reached his borders. Organized postal systems struck another blow. What began as royal courier services for kings and popes gradually extended to merchants and even common citizens. The Taxis family's postal network, established in the Holy Roman Empire by 1500, could relay messages from Brussels to Innsbruck in under 6 days faster than any chain of bells, and with detailed written instructions rather than coded tones. Towns now kept riders rather than bell ringers on standby, their horses saddled at the first rumor of trouble, yet these networks didn't vanish overnight. Like twilight lingering after sunset, bell towers adapted where they could. Coastal communities repurposed them as fog signals, their deep tones cutting through mist where visual warnings failed. In the Alps, avalanche warnings borrowed the old tocsin patterns, while mining towns used them to signal shaft collapses. Some found new peacetime roles. The Great Bell of Ghent, once the terror of French invaders, became the city's de facto clock, its chimes regulating work hours and market openings. Their most poignant evolution came full circle back to defense. When German Zeppelins raided London in World War I, the British revived medieval bell codes to warn of approaching airships. During the Blitz, church steeples became observation posts once more, their bells now replaced by wailing electronic sirens, direct descendants of those ancient bronze voices. Even today, the pulsing alert of a modern tornado siren unconsciously mirrors the uneven cadence of a medieval tocsin at full alarm. What truly faded wasn't the concept, but the shared language. Where every villager once knew whether 3 quick tolls meant fire or raiders, few today could decipher the surviving codes in towers like Siena's Mangia, where 14th century warning sequences still ring on special occasions. Yet in our instant message age, there's something haunting about those old stones. They remind us that long before fiber optics and satellites, human ingenuity found ways to make the very air speak, and that sometimes the simplest solutions outlast the empires they protected. Standing sentinel over modern Paris, the 12th century Tour Clovis remains one of the last intact medieval warning towers in Europe. Its weathered stones once trembled with urgent peals when Viking raiders rode up the Seine, but today it overlooks a quiet schoolyard, a silent guardian of forgotten fears. This paradox defines the handful of original bell towers that survived the centuries, structures born from desperation, now cherished as monuments to human cleverness. Across the continent, these scattered survivors tell dual stories of nights when their bells meant survival, and modern days when they've become bridges to a collective past. The Leaning Tower of Pisa offers perhaps the most famous example of repurposed defense architecture. Few tourists craning their necks at its famous tilt realize it began as a watchtower for the maritime Republic of Pisa, its bells originally meant to warn of Genoese warships. Over time, as coastal threats faded, its role softened into that of a civic clock tower and eventually a global curiosity. This evolution wasn't unique. Dozens of medieval towers gradually shifted from martial to municipal purposes, their heights perfect for displaying clocks when they no longer needed to spot invaders, their bells marking the hours instead of sounding alarms. Preservation efforts revealed just how deeply these structures straddled two worlds. When restorers repaired cracks in Siena's Torre del Mangia, they discovered 14th century graffiti, left by watchmen' crude tallies counting the days between Magyar raids alongside delicate frescoes of saints. This palimpsest of peace and war continues in modern ceremonies. Each year, on the anniversary of the Great Siege of 1386, the town of Alba in northern Italy performs a ceremonial tocsin with its original 13th century bell. The difference, today's ringing is followed not by the clash of arms, but by children's laughter during a historical reenactment festival. UNESCO recognition of these towers as World Heritage Sites formalizes what locals have always understood: they're not just buildings, but the physical memory of communal resilience. The inclusion criteria specifically cite their ingenious adaptation of sacred architecture to secular defense needs. This dual identity resonates powerfully in places like San Gimignano, where 14 surviving towers create a skyline unchanged since the Middle Ages. Visitors climbing their narrow staircases can still see the slots where watchmen once poured boiling oil, now framing panoramic views enjoyed by Instagrammers. Yet the most poignant survivals might be the traditions clinging to these ancient stones. In Ghent, the Roland bell, cast in 1315 to warn of fires, still rings during the annual Gentse Feasten, its voice now part of a joyous cacophony of street music. Austrian villages near the Slovenian border maintain bell prayers, a tradition where Easter tolls replicate the pattern used centuries ago to signal Ottoman advances. And high in the Swiss Alps, some remote parishes continue training children in the old alarm sequences, not because they're needed, but because, as one elder put it, the day we forget the sound of warning is the day we forget who protected us. These living connections transform cold stone into something far more powerful. When the Great Bell of Tournai in Belgium tolled during the 2016 terrorist alerts, residents described an eerie comfort in its familiar vibrations, proof that even in our digital age, some primal part of us still responds to those ancient bronze voices. Perhaps that's why cities spend millions preserving towers that serve no practical purpose anymore. They stand as reminders that safety was once a communal act, woven not from wires or algorithms, but from watchmen's eyes, bronze tongues, and the willingness of entire communities to listen. The echoes of those medieval bell towers didn't fade into history. They evolved, their core principles reborn in every major leap of human communication. Take the telegraph, that 19th century marvel that crisscrossed continents with clicking wires. At its heart lay the same idea that once guided watchmen on lonely towers, standardized codes traveling relay style between stations. Samuel Morse didn't just invent dots and dashes. He created a new kind of bell language where operators replaced ringers and copper wires carried signals faster than sound ever could. Even the telegraph's infrastructure mirrored its medieval predecessor, stations spaced at precise intervals, just like those towers standing 5 miles apart, each one receiving a message and passing it faithfully down the line. Modern emergency alert systems carry the torch even more visibly. The pulsing electronic wail of a tornado siren or the distinctive 3-tone sequence preceding a presidential alert aren't just noises, they're digital descendants of the tocsin's urgent patterns. Just as medieval villagers knew frantic, uneven ringing meant immediate danger, today's children drill for lockdowns when they hear staccato beeps over school intercoms. The principles remain identical: distinct, unforgettable sounds that bypass language and trigger instinctive responses. Even the testing schedules mimic the past, where towns once rang bells weekly to keep skills sharp. Wireless emergency alerts now chirp monthly on our phones, maintaining that ancient rhythm of preparedness. Cybersecurity reveals perhaps the most fascinating parallel. Medieval watchmen faced the same core challenge as modern IT experts. Information must outpace threats. When ransomware slithers through networks or hackers probe defenses, automated alerts propagate through servers like virtual bell towers, their digital clangs triggering protocols to isolate breaches. The entire concept of a firewall, a barrier that slows attackers while warnings spread, mirrors how border towers would buy time for inland villages. And just as false alarms could erode trust in bell networks, today's overly sensitive security systems risk alert fatigue, where constant warnings numb responses. The solutions: medieval communities devised strict controls on who could trigger alarms. Layered verification are echoed in modern multi-factor authentication and tiered access permissions. What these connections reveal is deeper than technological lineage. It's about human psychology. Whether facing Mongol horsemen or malware, we keep reinventing the same safeguards because they align with how we process danger. Studies show our brains respond fastest to repetitive, rhythmic alerts, exactly why air raid sirens and medieval tocsin bells share that same oscillating pattern. The need for clear hierarchies of urgency, a concept medieval towers mastered with their graded sequences, resurfaces in everything from hurricane categories to hospital triage systems. Even the public nature of these systems persists. Just as bell warnings reached rich and poor alike, modern emergency broadcasts skip paywalls and data plans, landing with democratic urgency on every device. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in our global networks themselves. The Internet, with its nodes and packets hopping between servers, operates on principles a medieval bell ringer would recognize: information broken into standardized chunks, relayed through trusted points, and reassembled at its destination. The very concept of pinging a server to check connectivity mirrors watchmen testing tower audibility by striking test tones at dawn. And when undersea cables snap or satellites fail, engineers still describe gaps in coverage as zones of silence, the same term chroniclers used for valleys between towers where echoes grew faint. Yet for all our fiber optics and encryption, those ancient bells still have lessons to teach. In 2016, when a hacker attack disabled Dallas's emergency sirens, triggering chaotic midnight alerts, officials realized their high-tech system lacked the simplicity of mechanical backups, the bronze and rope reliability that kept medieval warnings working even during sieges. Meanwhile, Japan's tsunami warning towers, direct descendants of coastal bell networks, proved their worth during the 2011 disaster, their physical alarms reaching fishermen already out of cell range. The past whispers to us that redundancy matters, that sometimes the oldest solutions persist because they address needs deeper than technology itself. As we navigate an age of deepfakes and information overload, the purity of those bell codes feels almost revolutionary. In a world where anyone can broadcast anything, there's power in systems where trust is earned through consistency, where signals are few but unmistakable. The next time your phone buzzes with an amber alert or a storm warning, listen closely. Beneath the digital tones, you'll hear the faint, persistent echo of 1,000 bronze bells still ringing across time, reminding us that the best ways to keep each other safe are often the ones that speak to our shared humanity. At first glance, the glowing screens of our smartphones tracking storm paths or the robotic voice announcing emergency alerts seem light, years removed from the bronze bells that once echoed between medieval towers. But strip away the technology, and you'll find the same ancient heartbeat, a pulse of urgency designed to outrun danger. Whether it's a satellite detecting missile launches or a 13th century watchman spotting Mongol dust clouds, every warning system shares one non-negotiable rule: speed must outpace threat. The methods have changed, the mission hasn't. Consider how medieval and modern systems wrestle with their own unique constraints, those bell towers we've been exploring. Their range was shackled by geography. Sound couldn't leap oceans or pierce mountain ranges. Today's satellite networks span the globe in milliseconds, yet they face a frontier the Middle Ages never imagined: cyber sabotage. In 2017, hackers spoofed Hawaii's emergency alert system with a false missile warning, triggering panic. It was the digital equivalent of a rogue bell ringer, sounding a fake invasion, proof that no matter the era, human error or malice remains the wild card in any warning chain. Yet the parallels run deeper than vulnerabilities. Both systems live or die on trust. When the tocsin rang in 1400, villagers had to decide instantly whether to grab children or weapons. No time for second guessing. That same split-second calculus plays out today when tornado sirens wail or phones buzz with evacuation orders. Psychologists call it alert credibility, a fragile commodity built over countless accurate warnings and shattered by a single false alarm. Medieval towns enforced this trust with draconian penalties for misuse. Modern agencies combat misinformation with verification protocols and public education campaigns. The stakes are identical: lose trust, and the next warning might be ignored. Weather once dictated the limits of medieval warnings. Fog could mute bells, while storms scrambled beacon fires. Our digital age has its own atmospheric gremlins. Solar flares can knock out GPS networks, while dense urban canyons distort cell signals just as valleys once distorted sound. The solutions reveal a shared ingenuity. Just as alpine villages added drum signals for foggy days, modern cities deploy backup radio networks when cellular grids fail. And where monks once kept meticulous logs of invasion patterns to refine their alerts, AI now crunches decades of hurricane data to predict evacuation windows. Different tools, same principle: adapt or perish. Perhaps the most striking similarity lies in how both systems reveal societal values. Those medieval bell networks weren't funded by kings but maintained collectively, a tax paid in grain or labor to keep watchmen fed and mechanisms oiled. Today's emergency infrastructure, from tsunami buoys to wildfire cameras, relies on similar communal investment through taxes and bonds. And just as bell codes flattened social hierarchies during crises, modern alerts deliberately bypass paywalls and language barriers. A presidential text reaches billionaire and barrister alike, much like the tocsin's echo once stirred lord and serf to the same defensive ditches. The true test of any warning system isn't technology but behavior. Archaeologists find evidence of medieval villages rebuilt slightly closer to bell towers after invasions, a quiet testament to learned dependence. Modern parallels abound: families stocking go bags after surviving wildfires, or cities hardening infrastructure post-hurricane. This feedback loop between warning and adaptation hasn't changed in 1,000 years. Whether the signal comes from vibrating bronze or a vibrating phone, the goal remains to carve out those precious minutes that separate chaos from survival. What medieval watchmen understood and modern engineers reaffirm is that no system is foolproof. Bells could be muffled by snow, satellites can be blinded by debris. The redundancy lies in the human network. Then as now, the final link is always a person turning to their neighbor and saying, "Did you hear that?" That moment of shared recognition is where technology meets humanity and where the real work of survival begins. Hollywood would have us believe medieval bell towers could send messages clear across Europe in minutes, their thunderous peals shaking the very Alps as every citizen snapped to attention. The truth, as always, is far more fascinating than the myth. Those cinematic portrayals of perfectly synchronized continental bell storms make for epic visuals, but they misunderstand how these networks truly operated. While the system was revolutionary for its time, its real genius lay in practical limitations, not superhuman feats of acoustics. Take the persistent legend that a bell rung in Vienna could be heard in Venice, a distance of over 200 miles. Physics alone debunks this. Even under ideal conditions with perfect stillness, the deepest church bells rarely carried beyond 15 miles. What made the network effective wasn't individual range, but the relay principle. Like runners passing a torch, each tower needed only to reach the next link in the chain. A warning might take half a day to cross a region, but that was still exponentially faster than messengers on horseback. Chronicles from the Swiss Confederacy describe invasions where bell signals outpaced mounted scouts by 6 hours, not instant, but decisive. Another romanticized notion is that invaders would flee at the mere sound of tolling bells. Reality was far messier. Seasoned raiders like the Mongols or Ottoman acoustics often interpreted alarms as proof of rich targets ahead, spurring them to attack with greater ferocity. The system's real value wasn't deterrence but preparation time. When the Burgundian army marched on Lorraine in 1475, towns didn't wait for enemies to arrive. They used the hours bought by bell warnings to flood fields, poison wells, and set ambushes in narrow passes. The bells didn't scare attackers away. They turned vulnerable settlements into hardened traps. The myth of perfect synchronization also crumbles under scrutiny. Unlike modern emergency broadcasts transmitted simultaneously to every device, medieval towers operated on slight delays, as each ringer confirmed the message before passing it along. A warning traveling from Marseille to Lyon wouldn't create a single wall of sound, but a ripple effect like dominoes falling in slow motion. Regional dialects in bell codes added another layer of complexity. What constituted an urgent alarm in Flanders might signal a festival in Provence, forcing towns to maintain signal translators, often monks familiar with neighboring regions' patterns. What's remarkable is how these limitations spurred innovation. Knowing bells couldn't cover continents, communities developed layered systems. Coastal towns paired towers with signal fires for foggy days. Alpine villages used sunlight-reflecting mirrors to flash warnings between peaks. The Hanseatic League even trained pigeons as backup messengers, a medieval version of redundant servers. These adaptations reveal the true sophistication beneath the surface, a system that embraced its imperfections and built workarounds accordingly. The real achievement wasn't magical acoustics, but human coordination. For every Hollywood fantasy of bells ringing themselves, there were countless unsung heroes, the tower keepers who spent freezing nights listening for distant peals, the children taught to recognize patterns before they could read, the artisans who tuned bells to complement their neighbors' tones. Their legacy isn't in exaggerated legends, but in proving that even fragmented communities could create something greater than the sum of its parts. When we strip away the myths, what remains is something far more inspiring. Ordinary people achieving extraordinary things with nothing but bronze, stone, and unwavering attention to the horizon. The deep, resonant voice of warning bells didn't just echo across valleys, it reverberated through the very soul of European culture, weaving itself into language, art, and collective memory. Long after the last invasion faded into history, these bronze sentinels left an indelible imprint, transforming from practical tools into powerful symbols of communal strength. Take our everyday speech phrases like "sound the alarm" or "clear as a bell" aren't just pretty metaphors, they're linguistic fossils preserving the terror and hope of generations who lived by those tones. When someone says "that rings a bell," they're unconsciously channeling an era when recognizing a specific toll pattern might mean the difference between life and death. Artists captured this cultural significance with striking clarity. Pieter Bruegel, the Elder's Apocalyptic, The Triumph of Death, shows skeletal armies overrunning a burning landscape, yet amid the chaos, one detail stands out: a lone bell tower still standing, its silhouette defiant against the crimson sky. For 16th century viewers, that tower wasn't just background scenery. It represented the last fragile bastion of order against overwhelming darkness. Similar motifs appear in stained glass windows from Chartres to Krakow, where bell towers often frame scenes of divine protection, visually linking earthly warnings with heavenly salvation. Music became another unexpected vessel for these echoes. Modest Mussorgsky's The Great Gate of Kiev opens with thunderous bell-like chords that don't just mimic sound, they recreate the physical sensation of standing beneath a massive tocsin. Centuries earlier, medieval composers had embedded bell rhythms into sacred polyphony, their interlocking patterns mirroring the way real watchtowers coordinated warnings. Even folk traditions absorbed this influence. Swiss alpine horns developed yodeling sequences that replicated the call and response of distant bells across valleys. The bell's cultural weight extended into rituals marking life's passages. In Brittany, villagers believed a newborn's first cry should coincide with the church bell's strike to ensure the child would grow up vigilant. German mining towns developed bell weddings, where couples married during prolonged ringing to symbolize their union's role in community protection. These weren't quaint customs, they were conscious efforts to bind personal milestones to collective survival, ensuring each generation internalized the tower's significance. Perhaps most telling is how these instruments outlasted their original purpose. When Napoleon ordered church bells melted for cannon fodder, peasant revolts erupted across Europe not just over lost metal, but over the erasure of oral landmarks that had structured daily life for centuries. Even today, when historic bells toll during memorials or national crises, they tap into something deeper than nostalgia, a cellular memory of centuries when communities literally listened for their lives. That persistent resonance proves true cultural impact isn't measured in decibels, but in how completely a sound becomes inseparable from what it means to belong. Constructing a bell tower capable of withstanding the brutal forces of swinging bronze demanded engineering brilliance that pushed medieval builders to their limits. Picture teams of masons carefully shaping massive stone blocks into stepped foundations, not just for height, but to distribute thousands of pounds of concentrated weight. The sheer mass of a great tocsin bell could exceed the weight of a fully laden ox cart, and when set in motion, it unleashed vibrations powerful enough to crack mortar. That's why the most advanced towers incorporated shock-absorbing timber skeletons within their stone shells, intricate wooden frameworks that flexed like a spine with each peal. In Strasbourg's Cathedral Tower, restorers recently discovered oak beams arranged in a helical pattern, a medieval innovation that turned the entire structure into a giant resonator while preventing destructive shaking. The tallest towers became obsessions spanning generations. Bruges' legendary belfry, soaring over 270 feet, consumed 83 years of continuous labor, enough time for stonemasons to train their grandchildren in the craft. What kept communities investing decades in these projects wasn't just practicality, but symbolism. Each completed tier visibly demonstrated a town's wealth and technical prowess, like the Italian city-states that deliberately made their campaniles taller than neighboring rivals. Siena's Torre del Mangia, built to exactly match the height of the cathedral spire, carried an unmistakable message: secular and sacred powers stood equals here. Survival through the centuries proved these weren't vanity projects. When the great earthquake of 1348 toppled castles across the Alps, the bell towers of Friuli remained standing, their flexible wooden joinery allowing them to sway rather than shatter. Similarly, the belfry of Ghent withstood repeated cannon strikes during the 80 Years' War, thanks to walls that thickened progressively toward the base. Modern engineers have identified these tapered designs as precursors to earthquake-resistant architecture, their sloping profiles dispersing stress like the trunk of an ancient oak. But the true marvel lies in how these builders worked without modern tools or mathematics. Master masons relied on rule-of-thumb proportions passed down through guilds, like the universal principle that a tower's base thickness should equal 1/10 its planned height. They compensated for limited measuring devices with ingenious tricks. The tilt-in-pieces tower likely originated from builders using the cathedral's completed floors as makeshift levels after rain distorted their initial trenches. Every imperfection became a lesson encoded in stone, with subsequent towers adopting slightly thicker walls or deeper pilings where predecessors showed stress cracks. These silent sentinels still guard their secrets. Recent laser scans of Beauvais Cathedral's unfinished tower revealed mysterious iron rods embedded in 13th century masonry, an early attempt at reinforcement that predates modern rebar by 600 years. Elsewhere, archaeologists have found crushed seashells mixed into mortar, a forgotten technique that improved flexibility. Each discovery peels back another layer of medieval ingenuity, reminding us that those towering silhouettes against the sunset aren't just relics of the past, but enduring masterclasses in how to build for the ages. The deep resonance of warning bells wasn't just a European phenomenon. It was a global solution to a universal problem. Half a world away from the stone towers of Burgundy, China's Great Wall snaked across mountains, dotted with beacon towers that used fire and smoke instead of sound. When Mongol riders appeared on the northern steppes, guards lit prearranged combinations of fuel, creating columns of smoke visible for miles. By day, these signals could relay simple messages, like the number of approaching riders through the spacing of fires. By night, the glow against the dark sky turned each tower into a fiery punctuation mark in a sentence racing across the landscape. Yet where Europe's system thrived on local initiative, China's was a tightly controlled military network, with imperial officers enforcing strict protocols and harsh penalties for errors. Islamic civilizations took a different approach, blending spiritual and defensive functions. Minarets, those slender towers calling the faithful to prayer, doubled as watchtowers during crises. Muezzins with the keenest eyesight would scan the horizon from their dizzying heights, and if danger appeared, the melodic call to prayer might shift into rapid, staccato beats on a large drum known as the nakara. In cities like Cairo and Damascus, these rhythms could mobilize entire neighborhoods within minutes. Unlike Europe's decentralized bell networks, Islamic warning systems often operated under the authority of local governors, their signals integrated into the broader administrative machinery of the caliphates. Across the Atlantic, the Aztecs built a system that relied not on bronze or fire, but on the thunderous voice of drums. Tenochtitlan's Huitzilopochtli, a massive ceremonial drum carved from sacred wood, could be heard for leagues across the lake basin. When scouts spotted Spanish ships approaching in 1519, the drum's deep, rolling tones spurred the city into a coordinated defense, proof that even without metalworking, indigenous engineers had mastered long-range communication. The Aztec system was uniquely tied to their cosmology. Certain rhythms invoked specific deities believed to lend strength in battle, weaving spiritual and practical preparedness into a single act. What makes these global parallels so fascinating isn't just their existence, but their contrasts. Europe's bell network stood out for their grassroots origins. Unlike China's imperial beacons or the Aztec state-controlled drums, European towers often sprang up organically, funded by villagers rather than kings. A farmer might donate a season's harvest to cast a new bell, while local guilds maintain the mechanisms. This decentralized approach created surprising resilience. When invaders destroyed one tower, others could adapt instantly, with no central command to disrupt. Yet all these systems shared a profound insight: that survival depends on transforming fear into coordination. Whether through smoke, drums, or bells, humans kept finding ways to make the landscape itself speak, a testament to ingenuity that transcended cultures. The next time you hear a siren or emergency alert, remember, you're part of an ancient chain, one that began when the first watchman struck bronze to warn others the storm was coming. Keeping those bronze voices ready to sound the alarm came at a steep price, one that entire communities shouldered together. A single bell rope, thick as a man's wrist and woven from the toughest hemp, would fray and snap within a year of constant use. Replacing it wasn't just a matter of stringing up new fiber. The massive counterweight systems required teams of laborers to rethread the mechanism, often dangling dangerously from scaffolding high above the town square. And that was just the simplest expense. When a bell cracked from years of hard strikes, a disaster that could leave a town defenseless, recasting it demanded hundreds of pounds of precious bronze, melted down in roaring furnaces and poured into molds painstakingly carved from local clay. The cost could bankrupt small villages, sometimes exceeding their entire annual tax revenues. To meet these burdens, medieval towns developed creative solutions. Some imposed special bell taxes, levying extra grain or silver from every household. In the Swiss canton of Uri, records show farmers paying their dues in wool, bundles of fleece that would later be woven into the very ropes that swung the bells. Other communities turned to spiritual incentives. The Italian city of Lucca offered indulgences, reductions in purgatory time, for citizens who donated metal to recast cracked tocsin bells. Churches became treasure troves of scrap bronze, with parishioners tossing everything from old cooking pots to broken sword hilts into melting pots during Sunday collections. But the most surprising currency wasn't silver or goods, it was time itself. In the French region of Burgundy, able-bodied men could trade months of military service for bell maintenance duty. Town ledgers list blacksmiths excused from archery practice to repair clappers, or carpenters spared from castle work to reinforce rotting belfry beams. This wasn't charity, it reflected cold calculations of survival. A well-maintained bell network could deter raids altogether, saving far more resources than constant warfare. Famines tested these priorities brutally. During the Great Hunger of 1315, the Council of Ypres faced an impossible choice: divert bell funds to buy grain, or keep their defenses operational while children starved. Their decision, recorded in trembling script on vellum still preserved today, was to have the bread ration but fully repair the tocsin. To modern eyes, this seems cruel. But medieval logic was ruthless. One season's starvation might claim dozens, but a single unheeded raid could erase generations. The true measure of their commitment shines through in ordinary receipts. A faded invoice from 1422 details the cost of replacing 3 Strasbourg bell ropes, 12 florins, 2 barrels of salt pork, and the promise of 2 choir boys to sing at the ropemaker's daughter's wedding. These weren't just transactions, they were threads in a social fabric where every citizen, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest tanner, had a stake in keeping the bronze voices alive. When the bells rang true, it meant the baker had kneaded his dough with hands calloused from hauling hemp. The noblewoman had parted with her grandfather's battle trophies to be melted down, and the farmer had gone hungry so the watchman could stay fed. Their sacrifices whisper across the centuries that vigilance was never cheap, but neither was surrender. Giotto's campanile in Florence stood watch over a city on the brink of annihilation in 1348. When whispers of the Black Death crept up trade routes from the east, it wasn't physicians or nobles who first sounded the alarm. It was the bell ringers high above the city's terracotta rooftops. Their tolls took on a new, dreadful rhythm. 3 slow strikes, a pause, then 3 more, a pattern Florentines came to know as the plague chime. Unlike the urgent cacophony of invasion alerts, this measured cadence gave households time to act. Merchants shuttered their stalls, priests redirected processions away from infected quarters, and guards sealed gates to neighboring districts. The tower's warnings couldn't stop the pandemic, but they bought Florence critical days to implement Europe's first organized quarantine, a tactic that likely spared thousands. Centuries later, historians studying parish records found death rates 20% lower in neighborhoods closest to the campanile, where the bells were clearest. Those resonant bronze notes became literal lifesavers, cutting through panic with something rare in that dark year: order. Vienna's Pommern bell faced a different kind of storm in 1529, the thunder of Ottoman cannons rattling the city walls. Cast from melted-down Turkish artillery captured in earlier battles, the massive bell embodied defiance even before its first toll. When Sultan Suleiman's forces surrounded the city, Vienna's defenders turned the Pommern into a psychological weapon. Instead of reserving it for alarms, they rang it continuously through the siege, deep, booming strokes that reverberated over the battlefield. To the Ottomans, it was a taunt; to the Viennese, a heartbeat. Chroniclers wrote of exhausted soldiers perking up at its sound, and citizens timing their fire bucket chains to its rhythm. The bell's most legendary moment came during a moonless night assault, when defenders, guided solely by its vibrations, poured boiling pitch onto scaling ladders they couldn't see. After the siege broke, the Pommern's surface was found pocked with arrows, its yoke cracked from overuse. Rather than repair it, the city left these battle scars untouched, turning the bell into a monument to resilience. England's Great Tom of Oxford played the opposite role during the Civil War. Its silence spoke louder than any toll. Perched atop Christ Church's Tom Tower, this 7-ton giant had marked curfews for generations with its 101 evening strokes. But when Royalist Oxford fell to parliamentarian forces in 1646, the new occupiers saw the bell not as a timekeeper, but as a potential rallying cry. They ordered its clapper chained, muzzling the city's most famous voice. For years, the only sound from the tower was the creak of that iron restraint swinging in the wind, a sonic symbol of suppressed rebellion. The bell's eventual restoration after the monarchy's return became one of London's most theatrical public spectacles, with thousands gathering to hear that first liberated chime. What made these towers extraordinary wasn't their size or beauty, but their agency. They didn't just witness history, they shaped it through sound. The campanile's measured warnings turned a passive population into active defenders against disease. The Pommern's battle-damaged peals unified a city under impossible pressure, and Great Tom's enforced silence demonstrated how controlling a tower's voice meant controlling the narrative itself. These weren't inert monuments, but protagonists in human crises, their bronze tongues giving communities something no sword or treaty could: the power to turn fear into coordinated action. In an age before mass media, they became the original influencers, not shaping opinions but survival. Modern visitors craning their necks at these towers rarely grasp their full legacy. The campanile's elegant white and pink marble facade belies its role as a public health sentinel. Tourists posing beneath the Pommern seldom notice the repaired crack from its 17th century fall, a reminder that even heroes have breaking points. And students hurrying past Great Tom might miss the subtle wear on its yoke from those years of forced silence. Yet these quiet details whisper a truth louder than any bell. When societies face existential threats, the tools that save them aren't always weapons or laws. Sometimes they're the instruments that teach people to listen and act together. There's a reason the deep, shuddering toll of a warning bell could send an entire village into motion before the first syllable of a shouted order left a watchman's lips. Modern neuroscience reveals what medieval communities understood instinctively. Low-frequency sounds bypass rational thought, speaking directly to the brain's most ancient survival circuits. When a massive bronze bell swings into motion, its vibrations generate frequencies between 50 and 200 Hz, a range that triggers the mammalian startle reflex, the same primal response that makes us freeze at thunder or a predator's growl. Unlike the melodious high notes of smaller chimes, these bass-heavy tones physically vibrate the sternum and diaphragm, creating a visceral sensation of danger that's impossible to ignore. Laboratories studying auditory alertness have found subjects react to low-frequency pulses 200 milliseconds faster than to spoken warnings, a life-saving difference when raiders crest the horizon. What made bell towers uniquely effective wasn't just their pitch, but their deliberate unpredictability. Clock towers marked time with metronomic regularity, their even cadence blending into the background hum of daily life. But a tocsin bell shattered that rhythm with jagged, irregular strikes, 3 rapid peals, a gasping pause, then 2 more patterns designed to spike cortisol levels. Acoustic researchers call this the oddball effect. The brain prioritizes processing irregular sounds over predictable ones, flooding the body with adrenaline. Medieval bell ringers mastered this psychology centuries before it had a name, their off-kilter sequences ensuring even sleeping villagers would jolt awake with their hearts already racing. Directionality gave bells another edge over human voices. While a shouted warning might be missed by those upwind or around corners, low-frequency sound waves propagate in near-perfect spheres, bending around obstacles and penetrating thick stone walls. Archaeoacoustic studies at Burgos Cathedral demonstrated how a single bell's tone could reach 97% of a medieval town's dwellings, compared to just 40% for a watchman's cry. This omnipresence created a shared physiological experience, entire communities literally feeling the same vibrations in their bones, synchronizing their fight or flight responses before exchanging a single word. Visual signals like smoke or flags paled in comparison. A beacon fire might be obscured by fog or misinterpreted as a harmless hearth, while banner codes required literacy in complex heraldic languages. But the tocsin's vibrations needed no translation. Infants, the elderly, even livestock reacted instinctively, a unity of response that turned scattered individuals into a cohesive survival unit. The few surviving records from besieged towns describe this phenomenon in eerie detail. Chickens fleeing to coops, dogs herding children, and grandmothers reaching for pre-packed satchels, all before the first soldier finished buckling his armor. Perhaps most remarkably, these soundscapes exploited humanity's collective memory of danger. Anthropologists note that pre-industrial societies worldwide associated deep, resonant tones with natural threats, avalanches, stampedes, or approaching storms. By tapping into this universal auditory lexicon, medieval towers didn't just warn, they triggered deeply encoded survival scripts. When that bronze voice spoke, it didn't say, "Listen." It said, "Remember," and in that moment of primal recollection, an entire continent learned to move as one. High on the wind-swept battlements of a Catalan watchtower, a figure cloaked in early morning mist pulls hard on a rain-slicked rope. Not a burly watchman as history might assume, but a woman whose name was never recorded. While chronicles celebrated the deeds of armored knights and noble lords, the silent labor of women formed the hidden sinew of Europe's bell networks. From the fishing villages of Normandy to the hilltop convents of Tuscany, women kept watch through countless sleepless nights, their sharp eyes tracing the horizon for the first glint of Viking sails or Ottoman banners. Convents became unexpected powerhouses of this defense system. Isolated and vulnerable, nunneries like Francis Montevillier's Abbey transformed their bell towers into precision instruments of vigilance. Records from 1264 reveal how the Sisters of Santa Lucia in Pisa developed a rotational watch schedule, with teams of nuns trained to distinguish between Genoese warships and merchant vessels by the cut of their sails. Their most ingenious adaptation, using the convent's choir acoustics to amplify the bell's reach, positioning singers in the tower stairwell to create resonant harmonics that carried warnings farther than physics should allow. When plague or battle claimed a town's bell ringer, it was often his widow who stepped into the breach. Guild restrictions technically barred women from the role, but emergencies bred pragmatism. In Bruges city archives, a faded contract from 1392 lists one Margaretha van Steen as keeper of the storm bell, her wages paid in wool and salt after her husband perished in a fire while trying to save the tower's mechanisms. Across the Channel, York Minster's account books show payments to the ringer's woman during the worst years of the Scottish raids, a discreet acknowledgement of the wives and daughters who kept the bells swinging when men were called to arms. The legend of La Campanera, the Spanish folk heroine immortalized in ballads, hints at how deeply women's efforts resonated even when official histories ignored them. According to oral traditions from Andalusia, this quick-thinking tavern keeper seized the bell ropes when pirates breached Cartagena's walls in 1487, using an alternating high-low pattern that neighboring towns recognized as code for attack from the sea. Contemporary chronicles credit the town's male bailiff with the warning, but the folk songs passed through generations of women grinding grain or weaving by firelight tell a different story. Modern researchers have found tantalizing corroboration in a Moorish prisoner's diary from the same era, describing a loud-voiced Christian woman whose ringing gave defenders critical minutes to rally. Beyond the towers, women's mastery of bell language shaped daily survival. In agrarian communities where men often worked distant fields, it fell to women and children to interpret signals and coordinate responses. A German village bell book from 1512 includes marginal notes in a feminine hand, detailing how to distinguish between fire warnings and calls to muster proof that this knowledge was systematically taught in domestic spaces. Midwifery manuals from the period reveal even more ingenious adaptations. Some rural birth attendants carried small handbells with distinctive tones, using them to summon help or warn of complications without violating privacy taboos. The true measure of their contribution emerges in the cracks of legal records. Court documents from Rouen show a linen draper's wife fined for unauthorized ringing during a false alarm, not for her actions, but because the magistrates begrudgingly admitted she'd followed procedure better than the official watchman. In Prague, a nun's impassioned defense of her convent's right to maintain its bell, for who tends the flock when the shepherds are blind, became so legendary it was carved into the tower itself. These fragments form a mosaic of quiet competence, one where women didn't just support the system. They often perfected it through observational skills and communal knowledge that male guilds couldn't replicate. What's lost in the silence of unrecorded lives speaks volumes. The worn grooves on spiral staircases where generations of women ascended with oil lamps to scan the night. The folk rhymes teaching girls to count intervals between tolls like other children counted nursery sheep. The subtle wear patterns on bell ropes, thinner at shoulder height in some towers, suggesting smaller hands maintaining the same relentless vigil. These unspoken testaments remind us that the continent's great shield of sound wasn't forged by swords alone, but by the overlooked hands that kept the bells ready to speak when darkness gathered on the horizon. Even the most finely tuned systems have breaking points, and Europe's bell networks were no exception. The winter of 1410 revealed just how fragile this auditory shield could be. As Lithuanian forces massed along the Polish border, their scouts had spent weeks studying the rhythm of the towers. They didn't just note the spacing between watch posts, they infiltrated villages, bribing blacksmiths and stable hands for details about maintenance schedules. On the night of the invasion, their sabotage was surgical. Bell ropes in a dozen key towers were sliced halfway through, the cuts concealed beneath the fibers. When sentries lunged for the ropes at the first sight of torches moving through the snow, the hemp snapped like rotten thread. The result was a deadly silence where there should have been a chorus of alarms. By the time backup horns sounded, Lithuanian cavalry had already severed the escape routes to 3 major towns. Chronicles from the period describe the aftermath in haunting detail: abandoned towers with their great bronze bells still mute, their tongues useless as the invaders methodically picked off settlement after settlement. The massacre at Magdeburg in 1631 exposed a different vulnerability: human hesitation. As Protestant forces gathered outside the city, tension had simmered for weeks. Watchmen spotted the advancing army at dawn but delayed sounding the tocsin, convinced the movement was a supply convoy. That fatal pause, barely 20 minutes, meant the gates remained unbarred when the first cannon shots rang out. By the time the bells finally swung into action, their warnings were drowned by screams and collapsing masonry. The tragedy became a grim lesson in the cost of second-guessing. Surviving town records show frantic revisions to protocols afterward, with watchmen ordered to err toward alarm at the slightest uncertainty. Yet these catastrophes didn't discredit the system, they forced it to evolve. Within years of the Lithuanian breach, towns began installing secondary bells high in tower alcoves, their ropes kept behind locked grates accessible only to sworn officers. Nuremberg took it further, developing an ingenious dual rope mechanism where cutting one would trigger a counterweight to ring the bell anyway. Encryption became another layer of defense. Venetian towers adopted signal patterns based on the day's gospel reading, a cipher that changed daily and required insider knowledge to interpret. Along the Scottish border, watchmen used alternating sequences of bell strikes and horn blasts, ensuring that even if one system failed, the other might carry the warning. The deeper revelation was philosophical. These failures proved that no technology, no matter how brilliant, could compensate for broken trust or complacency. A bell tower was only as strong as the community maintaining it, the guilds that oiled its mechanisms, the farmers who donated wool for new ropes, the children who memorized its patterns. When Magdeburg's watchmen hesitated, or when Lithuanian spies exploited loose tongues, they didn't just break a chain of towers, they shattered a chain of vigilance that had taken generations to forge. What emerged from the ashes was resilience. Towns that had once jealously guarded their bell codes began sharing them with neighbors, realizing secrecy mattered less than solidarity. The Great Tocsin of Strasbourg, recast after a fire in 1640, bore an inscription that captured this hard-won wisdom: "I speak not for one, but for all." Those words echoed beyond metal. They became the unspoken creed of every watchman who scanned the horizon, every ringer who gripped a fraying rope, knowing that in that moment, an entire continent's safety might swing with them. The cobbled streets of Carcassonne come alive each summer with a sound not heard in earnest for centuries: the urgent, uneven peals of medieval alarm bells ringing across its double-walled fortress. But these aren't signals of approaching danger. They're the centerpiece of the town's annual festival of the tocsin, where visitors from around the world gather to step into the shoes of long-dead watchmen. Under the guidance of costumed interpreters, modern hands grip the same sun-warmed ropes that once sent warnings rippling across Languedoc, learning to replicate precise sequences like the wolf strike, 3 rapid tolls for bandits, or the broken wheel rhythm staggered pauses signaling fire. What begins as playful mimicry often turns profound when participants realize how exhausting it was to swing a 2-ton bell, a revelation that transforms abstract history into aching muscles and sweat-soaked tunics. Academics have turned these living experiments into serious research tools. At the University of Burgundy's experimental archaeology site, a full-scale replica tower stands surrounded by microphones placed at exact historical intervals. Teams measure how different alloys and striking techniques affect sound propagation, debunking myths. No, bells couldn't be heard over 50 miles while uncovering subtler truths. Their most striking discovery, the strategic advantage of slightly off-tune bells when neighboring towers intentionally cast their bronzes to different pitches. Their combined tones created a dissonance that cut through background noise like a modern alarm's 2-tone system. For younger visitors, the educational impact is undeniable. At Warwick Castle's Defender's Quest interactive exhibit, children decipher signal patterns like medieval cryptographers, matching bell sequences to illustrated threat cards showing Viking ships or plague carts. The genius lies in its simplicity. By turning history into a game, the lesson lodges deeper. A teacher from Birmingham recently recounted how her students, after visiting the exhibit, spontaneously recreated bell codes during a school fire drill, proof that these ancient systems still speak powerfully to the modern mind. The emotional resonance surprises even seasoned historians. In San Gimignano, where 14 towers still pierce the Tuscan sky, tourists can pay to ring the oldest functioning tocsin in Europe, the 13th century campanon. Staff report grown men weeping as the vibrations course through them, a physical connection to ancestors who once listened for that very sound with life or death intensity. Some Japanese visitors, descendants of samurai families familiar with their own tradition of alarm conch shells, have drawn poignant parallels between cultures separated by continents but united by the universal language of warning. Preservation meets innovation in unexpected ways. Ghent's Bell Museum employs augmented reality headsets that overlay spectral images of medieval ringers onto the actual ropes, allowing visitors to duet with ghostly counterparts. Meanwhile, in Austria's Wachau Valley, vineyards have revived the practice of using bells to ward off hail, not out of superstition, but because studies show the acoustic vibrations genuinely disrupt hailstone formation. It's a reminder that these towers weren't just relics of fear, but tools of ingenuity adaptable to new threats. The festival's true brilliance lies in what they don't romanticize. Reenactors in Rouen demonstrate the grim reality of tower life, how winter cold could freeze mechanisms solid, or how wealthy towns might hoard bronze for decorative chimes while border villages made do with cracked handbells. These unvarnished details dissolve nostalgia, revealing the system's fragility alongside its triumphs. When a child in Carcassonne asked why the watchman's hut had a bed, the answer, because men died falling asleep on their feet, landed with sobering force, etching the human cost of vigilance into young minds far more effectively than any textbook could. What began as tourist attractions have become something richer, a dialogue across time. As professors from Oxford and Sorbonne collaborate with traditional bell founders to recreate lost alloys, or as TikTok videos of amateur ringers go viral with #medieval vibes. These projects prove that history isn't just something we study, it's something we feel in our bones, quite literally, when those ancient bronze voices swing into motion once more. The towers may no longer stand guard against invaders, but they've found a new purpose, bridging centuries through shared sound and reminding us that the past was never silent. Those medieval bell towers hold urgent lessons for our modern world, not as relics, but as masterclasses in crisis response that put many of our high-tech systems to shame. Their first revelation, complexity kills when seconds count. Today's emergency alerts often drown in menus, apps, and conflicting protocols, while the tocsin's genius lay in its brutal simplicity. One sound, one meaning, no interpretation needed. Hurricane Katrina exposed this flaw tragically. Evacuation orders got lost in bureaucratic layers, while communities with hand-crank sirens reacted fastest. The towers prove that during chaos, the best technology is the kind a child can understand. But hardware alone wasn't enough. The real magic was in the drills. Medieval villages didn't just install bells and hope for the best. They trained relentlessly, turning emergency responses into muscle memory through weekly rehearsals. Compare that to modern offices where fire alarms go ignored because no one practices evacuation routes, or cities where tsunami warning signs gather dust until disaster strikes. The difference isn't knowledge, it's repetition. Those farmers who dropped plows and sprinted to walls didn't do so because they were braver. They'd performed that exact motion 100 times before. In an era of climate change and cyber threats, we've forgotten that survival isn't about having plans, but about engraving them into instinct. Yet the tower's most piercing lesson cuts deeper. Trust is the currency of crisis. No alarm system works if people doubt its source. Medieval towns enforced this through brutal accountability. False ringers faced execution, while reliable watchmen earned generations of respect. Today, our fractured information landscape has eroded that bond. When COVID warnings became politicized and wildfire alerts mixed with conspiracy theories, the result was fatal hesitation. The bell networks thrived because they were community-owned. Every villager had skin in the game, from the wool merchant supplying ropes to the child reciting codes. Modern alerts often feel imposed from distant capitals, creating a dangerous disconnect. The remedy might lie in returning to those medieval principles. After Japan's 2011 tsunami, surviving towns revived neighborhood watch systems where trusted locals, not faceless authorities, delivered evacuation orders. In Norway, volunteer-run avalanche warnings now outperform automated sensors because residents trust longtime ski guides more than algorithms. Even tech giants are learning. Google's earthquake alerts gained credibility by partnering with local geologists rather than relying solely on AI. These successes all echo the same truth. The human element isn't a flaw to eliminate. It's the glue that binds any warning system together. What those ancient towers whisper across the centuries isn't just about surviving invasions, but about preserving society itself. Their bronze voices didn't just carry sound, they carried collective resolve, a promise that when danger came, no one would be left unheard. In our age of viral misinformation and fragmented attention, that promise feels more vital than ever. Perhaps the ultimate warning the bells leave us isn't about preparing for the next disaster, but about rebuilding the trust that makes any warning matter at all. From the clang of a single bell to the ripple of alerts across a continent, this system wasn't just about bronze and rope. It was a testament to what happens when ordinary people choose collective survival over individual fear. Picture the chain reaction. A shepherd in the Carpathians spots dust on the horizon. A monk in the Rhineland tightens his grip on the bell rope. and within hours, farmers in the Loire Valley are driving livestock into hidden gullies, all without a single word exchanged. That invisible thread of trust woven across hundreds of miles and countless lives turned scattered villages into something greater than the sum of their parts. What's humbling is how these communities achieved this without centralized command. No medieval king dictated the spacing of towers or standardized the codes. The system grew organically, each town adding its link to the chain because the alternative was unthinkable. When raiders breached one border, the next valley over didn't wait for permission to sound the alarm. They acted, knowing others would do the same. In an age before instant communication, they grasped a truth we often forget. Real security isn't built from the top down, but from the ground up, through countless small acts of mutual responsibility. There's poetry in how they weaponized something as intangible as sound. While castles crumbled under cannon fire and walls were scaled, the warnings themselves couldn't be captured or destroyed. Cut one bell rope and the next tower would pick up the call. Silence one valley and the message would find another path, skipping across hilltops like a stone across water. Even the Mongols, masters of psychological warfare, couldn't fully mute this network. Their own chronicles grudgingly admit how Christian bells spoke faster than horses could run. The legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern cybersecurity protocols unconsciously echo those medieval principles, with decentralized nodes passing alerts at the speed of light instead of sound. When a power grid detects an intrusion today, it doesn't wait for human approval to isolate the breach. It acts, trusting neighboring systems will do the same, much like those watchmen of old. Even our social media age, for all its noise, carries faint whispers of the tocsin's logic. A single tweet about an incoming storm can ripple across networks, morphing into emergency alerts and community action. The mediums change, but the human impulse remains to turn fear into coordination and isolation into solidarity. Next time you pass an old church tower, look up. Those weathered stones once thrummed with urgency, their vibrations carrying the weight of survival. The bells may now mark only the hours, but they stand as silent witnesses to an era when entire civilizations balanced on the edge of a sound wave. In our world of satellites and smartphones, it's worth remembering that the most resilient systems aren't always the most complex. Sometimes they're the ones that speak directly to our shared humanity. If this journey through history resonated with you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the forgotten innovations that shaped our world. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. What everyday object today might seem ordinary now but could inspire awe in historians centuries from now? A smartphone, a solar panel, drop your predictions in the comments below. Until next time, keep listening for those echoes of the past. They have more to teach us than we might.